Senate Committee on Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs will come to order. Today's hearing, again, is in a hybrid format. Witnesses are in person. Thank you both for being there. I know you have busy schedules, including today, so thank you. Members have the option to appear in person or virtually, as you know. Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine has massacred innocent civilian communities, leveled cities, weaponized food and energy sources, imperiled the security of a nuclear facility, and jeopardized the future of a sovereign democracy. His actions also, we know, threaten global order, drawing a clear distinction between those who stand for democracy and rule of law and the forces of repression and tyranny. But there are two things that Putin did not count on. First, the resilience and strength of the spirit of the Ukrainian people on clear display last week again when the Ukrainian military retook Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city. Second, the ability of President Biden to assemble and lead a broad, unified coalition of allies and to keep that coalition together. This administration, with bipartisan and bicameral support from Congress, has spearheaded a forceful, comprehensive, and multilateral response to support the Ukrainian people and to isolate Russia. Today's hearing examines the economic piece of the administration's strategy. This hearing follows on the committee's work in evaluating our sanctions policy, as we did last year at a hearing on Treasury sanctions review, and a hearing this past July where we heard from the Commerce Department on its expansive restrictions on exports to Russia. Because we're united, our efforts are beginning to work. As Secretary of State Blinken said the other week, Putin thought he would divide and weaken NATO. Again, Putin was wrong. His actions have led to NATO's growth. We're now poised to welcome Sweden and Finland. His actions led to NATO's growth, reminding the world the vital role this alliance of democracies plays. In America, increasing the world is wise to Russian propaganda. This administration has corralled an unprecedented multilateral coalition, which includes our European partners and other allied countries, to impose one of the most comprehensive sets of economic sanctions in recent years. These measures aim to limit trade and financial regulations with Russia, to penalize corrupt Russian oligarchs for supporting Vladimir Putin, and to cripple Russia's economy, cutting off support for funding this brutal and immoral war. We've dramatically escalated this economic effort, and it's impacting every sector. Sanctions against a number of major Russian banks, dozens of Russian officials and Putin associates, expanded export controls that restricts Russia's access to the technologies needed to sustain its aggressive military capabilities, limitations on imports of Russian energy products, even the seizure of the $300 million yacht owned by a sanctioned Russian oligarch. The impact of the administration's smart and targeted economic measures has rippled throughout the Russian economy, damaging their defense industrial base. Ukrainian troops have found Russian military equipment rigged with semiconductors that appear to have been taken out of home appliances like dishwashers and refrigerators. As we pass the 6-month mark of the war, we welcome back Elizabeth Rosenberg, who serves as Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at the Department of Treasury, and welcome Andrew Adams, Director of the Klepto Capture Task Force at the Department of Justice. We look forward to hearing from the witnesses about the economic sanctions designed to weaken Russia's economy and about our efforts to pursue Russian oligarchs' assets. We're making it increasingly difficult for Putin to fund his brutal war in the face of a shrinking Russian economy and its isolation on the global stage. We must maintain the pressure of our many sanctions regimes. We must keep the coalition intact. With so much of Russia's revenue coming from energy sales, I look forward to hearing more from the witnesses today about the intended impact and status of the price cap negotiations. Just last week, I met with a group of Ukrainian Americans from Ohio. My state is proud to have a vibrant, active Ukrainian community. Their message was clear: we cannot lose the momentum. We must continue to hold the Russian government and sanctions evaders responsible. The multilateral coalition, which President Biden adeptly assembled, rolled out a sweeping series of rules designed to degrade Russia's military and technological capabilities. We will not let up while Russia continues to threaten the sovereignty of Ukraine. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses. Last week, Ukrainian forces recaptured the town of Izium in eastern Ukraine. It had been occupied by Russian soldiers for 6 months. In the streets, overjoyed and tearful residents celebrated their liberation. But in a forest just outside town, the horrors of Russia's invasion were once again revealed. Ukrainian soldiers discovered a mass grave filled with hundreds of civilians. Many of these victims are believed to have been tortured, bound, assaulted, and murdered, not unlike the horrors that occurred in Bucha in April. Our government has rightly said such atrocities committed by the Russians are war crimes. Identifying and prosecuting these war crimes are crucial to bringing justice to the Ukrainian people. But let's be clear. These crimes will continue unless we can force Vladimir Putin and those around him into concluding to abandon the invasion, to conclude that abandoning the invasion is better than continuing it. Ending this war on terms acceptable to Ukraine's democratic government is not just a morally righteous undertaking for the United States. It is also in the vital interests of our allies and ourselves. The outcome will have ramifications far beyond Ukraine. We cannot allow revisionist autocrats to feel free to redraw international borders and fundamentally challenge global stability. The principles of sovereignty and freedom must mean something, even when facing down the barrel of a gun. The stakes are high in Europe, where the United States has deep and long-standing security commitments, and they reach as far as Asia, where the Chinese government is taking note of how the U.S. and its allies respond to Russia's invasion of its smaller neighbor. Today, this committee will examine the existing and future sanctions that the U.S. and its allies will bring to bear on the Kremlin for its invasion of Ukraine. While the outcome of the war will be determined on the battlefield, sanctions have the potential to dramatically hasten an end to the conflict by depriving the Kremlin of the funds it needs to continue this war. And let's be honest, the sanctions imposed on Russia thus far have not yet come remotely close to achieving this objective. Roughly $1 billion in hard currency continues to flow into the Kremlin's war chest every day from energy sales. Treasury Deputy Secretary Wally Adeyemo recently acknowledged, and I quote, "There's one part of the Russian economy doing even better than when the war began, their oil industry," end quote. By the way, Russia's gas industry is doing equally well. Gazprom recently announced record profits of over $40 billion, record profits for the first part of this year. Today's hearing will focus on the administration's plan for a novel sanctions regime that imposes price caps on the purchase of Russian oil. This is an intriguing idea. I hope it will be considered for Russian gas as well. The premise of the idea is simple. Service providers, such as financiers and insurers within the G7, will only be permitted to facilitate the purchase of Russian oil below the set cap price. Given that the vast majority of such service providers are in fact domiciled in G7 countries, I think this plan has the potential to significantly curtail Russian oil revenue. But several questions remain about this program, including how low will the price cap be set? What will enforcement of the cap look like? And how will the administration ensure that buyers in countries like China and India do not skirt the price cap for their own gain? This last question is arguably the most important to determining the effectiveness of this price cap regime. And because it is so important, Senator Van Hollen and I plan to introduce legislation that will complement the administration's price cap scheme and impose mandatory sanctions on any foreign financial institution worldwide involved with any transaction in Russian oil above the price cap. The legislation will be the first major bipartisan sanctions legislation that has been introduced on Russia since February, and I intend to work with Senator Van Hollen to get this bill enacted as soon as possible so that Russia can no longer profit from the oil sales funding its war in Ukraine. 7 months after Putin began his special operation, as he puts it, in Ukraine, the Ukrainians have conducted a remarkably successful campaign to liberate portions of the country from Russian control. Concerns harbored by China and India about Putin's war have been aired publicly, and gas prices in Europe are actually falling, down 45% since late August. This war is not going as planned for Putin. I say this to my colleagues, now is not the time for half measures or complacency. It's time to crush the Kremlin's ability to continue this war. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Toomey. I'll now introduce today's witnesses, Elizabeth Rosenberg, Assistant Secretary of Terrorist Financing and Financial Crimes at Treasury, Welcome back to the committee. As Assistant Secretary, she is responsible for leveraging the Treasury Department tools to target threats to national security and safeguarding the financial system from abuse. We also welcome Andrew Adams, Director of the Klepto Capture Task Force at DOJ, a task force and interagency law enforcement endeavor led by justice, prosecutors, and dedicated to enforcing the sweeping sanctions in response to Russia's unprovoked military invasion. Former federal prosecutor from New York, where he focused on organized crime, money laundering, and the recovery of assets. Assistant Secretary Rosenberg, please begin.
Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Toomey, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the Department of the Treasury's efforts to hold Russia accountable for its brutal and unjustified further invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. Department of the Treasury is working with administration partners, including my colleague from the Department of Justice, who I'm joined by today, to implement the U.S. government's holistic response to Putin's war. Since the further invasion began 6 months ago, we've been advancing President Biden's promise to squeeze Russia's access to finance and technology for strategic sectors of its economy and degrade its industrial capacity for years to come. Just last week, we imposed sanctions to further degrade Russia's military, hold perpetrators of this war accountable, and financially isolate Putin. To date, Treasury has sanctioned hundreds of Russian individuals and entities, and this includes a majority of Russia's largest financial institutions, key nodes in Russia's military-industrial supply chains, and the oligarchs and cronies who help perpetuate Putin's war. The United States has been joined by over 30 countries, collectively representing more than half of the global economy, in imposing sanctions, the largest sanctions regime in modern history. On the other side, Russia's propagandists have been aggressively attempting to bury any unfavorable news and push misinformation, saying that, for example, sanctions are not working and cause food insecurity. In fact, Russia has crippled Ukraine's farming and export economy and dramatically driven up global energy and grain prices. U.S. and partner economic responses to Russia's war have had and will continue to have a significant effect on Russia's ability to fund its war. Russia has been forced to impose draconian capital controls. The IMF expects Russia's economy will contract for at least the next 2 years, a sharp reversal from its 4.7% growth in 2021. The Russian stock market is about 35% below pre-war levels. Russia is unsustainably burning through its rainy day funds, moving towards fiscal deficit by year's end. Simply put, Russia's economic picture is bleak and deteriorating. Significantly, these economic constraints are translating into real battlefield difficulties for Russia. Struggling to import industrial goods and technology, Russia has been forced to turn to outdated equipment and approach global pariahs like North Korea and Iran to source material. Because Russia is a sizable international economy and a globally important energy producer, imposing financial costs on Russia while mitigating the consequences of Russia's actions has required extraordinary planning, coordination, economic analysis, diplomacy, and creative policymaking. We have been keenly focused on Russia's large volume oil exports and windfall earnings in a high energy price environment. At this point, this represents Russia's primary source of hard currency. Given the global nature of oil markets, elevated energy prices affect us all, including American households that have seen rising prices at the pump and inflationary pressure across the economy. High energy prices hit the poorest the hardest in our country and across the world. Our effort, alongside an international coalition, starting with the G7, to impose a price cap on maritime Russian oil exports is the most viable option to support the security and affordability of the global oil supply. The policy involves price cap coalition countries offering services for Russia's maritime transport of oil priced below the cap and refraining from doing so for oil priced above the cap. The majority of providers of some maritime services, like insurance, payments, and trade finance, are located within the G7 and EU countries. So there's an overwhelming economic incentive for buyers to purchase under the price cap so that they can engage these services. It will be cheaper and less risky to move Russian oil cargoes in this way. We're already seeing this policy work, with Russia forced to negotiate steep discounts for oil it sells to buyers in Asia. To close, I'd like to express my gratitude for the additional resources Congress provided in the Ukrainian supplemental appropriations packages, which help us at Treasury and across the U.S. government surge in the policy response to Russia's war and, critically, support the people of Ukraine I would be happy to answer any further questions you have in this setting and to continue to work with you all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. Director Adams.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Brown. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today on behalf of the United States Department of Justice in my capacity as Director of the Department's Russian Sanctions Task Force, Klepto-Capture, to discuss the important work of the task force in response to Russia's unprovoked, illegal, and brutal war of aggression in Ukraine. The atrocities committed since Russia's February invasion have been well publicized. Russian attacks have devastated Ukrainian cities, leaving some on the verge of humanitarian collapse. Estimates are that as many as 1.6 million Ukrainians have been interrogated, detained, and forcibly deported to Russia under the oversight of Russian officials. And numerous news reports have detailed how the Russian campaign against Ukrainians includes a program of torture and rape, reporting that tragically finds support in the findings of mass graves and devastation uncovered in the wake of Russia's retreat from the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive. This is why the work of the task force is so important. Our targets have and continue to profit from a system of corruption and violence, and they continue to sustain and enable that same corrupt and violent regime. Their willingness to facilitate and acquiesce in Russia's malign activities contributes to the death and destruction that we are witnessing in Ukraine. The task force is dedicated to enforcing the sanctions, export restrictions, and economic countermeasures that the United States has imposed along with its international allies and partners in response to this unprovoked military invasion. It draws on the expertise of and energy of agents, analysts, translators, and prosecutors throughout the department and throughout the U.S. government, including prominently our colleagues at the Treasury Department. Our goals are first to bring charges against any individual or entity sanctioned under the Treasury designations or limited through Commerce Department rulemaking rolled out in response to Russian aggression. With respect to people and entities on those lists, we will pursue any charge or seizure theory available. Sanctions evasion and money laundering are obvious charges and theories in this space, but if opportunities to bring charges on bank fraud, visa fraud, extortion, or any other federal crime are presented as to a listed person or entity, that is a charge that this task force will support and pursue. Second, we would target those who would facilitate the evasion of economic sanctions and the Commerce Department's export controls. For banks, real estate agents, broker-dealers, exporters, manufacturers, shipping companies, and others, our goal is to shine a light where sanctioned actors may otherwise operate in shadow. Now, our immediate focus has been on disruption of those individuals and entities who have aided and supported the Russian regime. We've worked quickly with international partners to seize an oligarch's $90 million luxury yacht in Spain, to seize and transport a roughly $500 million yacht from Fiji to San Diego Harbor, to seize millions of dollars associated with sanctioned parties held at multiple U.S. financial institutions, and to pursue oligarchs involved in violations of U.S. export controls. We've also filed and unsealed charges against Russian oligarchs themselves and their associates for evading sanctions and other related crimes. The department welcomes the committee's consideration of legislation to augment the task force ability to seek charges and seize assets resulting from oligarchs' corrupt dealings with the Russian government and enable the transfer of proceeds from those actions to Ukraine to remediate the harms caused by the Russian aggression. In addition, the department continues to advocate for the following key proposals. One, our proposal to clamp down on the facilitation of sanctions evasion by amending the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, and its penalty provision to extend the existing forfeiture authorities to facilitating property and not simply to the proceeds of such offenses. Second, our proposal to add criminal violations of IEPA and the Export Control Reform Act to the definition of racketeering activity in the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act, or Rico. This proposal would extend a powerful forfeiture tool against racketeering enterprises engaged in sanctions violations and pave the way for prosecutions that appropriately capture the scope and the complexity of these evasion networks. Third, our proposal to extend the statute of limitations from 5 to 10 years for money laundering in connection with certain foreign offenses, which would grant our prosecutors time to follow the money and unravel the complex networks on which oligarchs rely to hide their wealth. And fourth, our proposal to improve the United States' ability to work with our international partners to recover assets linked to foreign corruption. I appreciate the opportunity to appear here today and to discuss the task force focus and efforts to date and potential legislation as it relates to Russia's unprovoked and illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Director. If we need yet another reminder that competency and commitment to our nation's core values of democracy and the rule of law are essential to good government, we need to look no further than this administration and its Herculean effort to impose targeted smart sanctions in Russia, targeting export controls. It has leveraged targeted export controls in the Russian economy, done so with an unprecedented multilateral coalition. And of course, we must continue to ratchet up the pain if Russia continues to fight this war of aggression. Assistant Secretary Rosenberg, two questions. Tell us the right metrics to determine whether sanctions are working. And as you discuss that, what are the more significant challenges to make sure the sanctions continue to achieve that purpose?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. As you've noted, the sanctions that the United States and over 30 countries have put in place alongside export controls have had a powerful economic effect in achieving our goal, depriving Russia of revenue and of military equipment to wage its brutal war. Some metrics here. Half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves have been locked up. Russia has been forced to resort to these draconian capital controls. It is burning through its fiscal buffers, heading towards fiscal deficit by the end of the year. It's struggling to fund imports, including of critical industrial goods necessary for manufacturing. And this is translating into battlefield difficulties for Russia, crucial to the goal of depriving Russia of the ability to fight its war. Specifically, it has had to cannibalize its own domestic industry in order to manufacture battlefield equipment it cannot procure on the international market because of the capital controls in particular. It's also compelled to look to international pariahs, Iran and North Korea, in order to source some of its military equipment. The soldiers on its front line don't have access to the most modern warfighting equipment. Those are important indicators of the criteria that we should look to for the efficacy of this policy approach. With regard to challenges here, something that is forefront for us at the Treasury Department and our colleagues throughout the U.S. government and elsewhere is to look to opportunities Russia may be pursuing to evade the sanctions, to find ways to skirt controls in order to engage in procurement for its military equipment. A current and future priority for us will be looking to enforce sanctions that get at Russia's supply networks that it may be using for evasion.
Thank you. What else can be done to keep the pressure on Russia?
In addition to the priority I just noted, going after major enforcement efforts, looking at Russia's illicit procurement networks, we can work closely with international allies to ensure that they are enforcing their own sanctions and expanding and augmenting them in ways that complement measures we have in place. For example, some of our partners still have the opportunity to put full blocking sanctions on some entities that we have fully blocked in the United States.
Thank you. Earlier this month, the administration, along with other G7 countries, announced the plan that you both mentioned, you both discussed, to impose a price cap on imported Russian oil. Ranking Member Toomey spoke positively about its possibilities. Secretary Yellen said it would significantly reduce Russia's main source of funding for its illegal and immoral war, but keep supplies flowing to global energy markets. What do you estimate its impact would be to the Russian economy if the price cap is effective, number one? And as you answer, talk about the necessity, or is there a necessity that China and Russia to be a partner, or at least be helpful, or at least not be opposed to these?
Thank you for the question. Many of us have noticed and focused on the fact that Russia is earning windfall profits from energy exports, given that it has driven up energy prices itself by invading Ukraine. And with this in mind, the G7 has put forward this price cap policy. It will have two major economic effects. So to affirm what Secretary Yellen has said, This will deprive Russia of revenue because it will be compelled to sell into the price cap here at lower prices. And a second important economic effect is that given this downward pressure on prices, developing economies will have the opportunity to purchase them for less, for a lower price. That's significant to them and significant to security of supply. You mentioned China. It's important to note that China
And India, I may have misspoke, China and India both.
China and
Comment on-
India. It's important to note that it's not essential by design of this policy. It's not essential for such countries, such major importers of Russian oil, to formally join this group. They can nevertheless use the existence of the price cap to leverage lower prices from Russia. And in fact, we're seeing that already, where Asian purchasers have used the price cap in order to leverage lower prices, cut rate prices for Russian energy. That's this policy already at work.
Thank you. Senator Toomey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to focus on two aspects of this idea that the administration has developed, the likelihood of evasion, but also the price cap level itself. The Treasury's guidance on the price cap plan so far indicates that the policy is constructed as a prohibition on service providers within the G7 countries who finance, insure, and broker Russian oil transactions above this price cap level, wherever it ends up being set. And as I said, I am hopeful that this will be effective. It strikes me as a very constructive step. But obviously, it is not meant to apply. It does not apply, certainly not directly, to oil service providers outside the G7. We've seen a huge increase in Indian and Chinese purchases of oil, just as U.S. and European purchases have declined. In fact, those purchases have fully offset the decline of the U.S. and the EU. And my concern is that China and India will continue to buy Russian oil, and probably on a large scale, they'll do so with their own service providers. Might not be quite as convenient as the existing regime, but they're quite capable of insuring and brokering and financing oil sales with indigenous companies and capabilities. So I wonder if briefly, Ms. Rosenberg, you could comment on any concerns you have that there is still this mechanism, this opportunity for Russia to continue to sell oil, albeit not to G7 countries or those who use services of G7 countries, but outside of the G7.
Thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to address these important questions. This price cap policy envisions a scenario where countries, China and India, for example, continue to purchase Russian oil. That is envisioned within this policy. Yeah. And it's possible that they could purchase that oil below the cap using G7 services. For example, there's a distinct advantage for them to do so. 80 to 90% of maritime insurance is concentrated in service providers within the EU, or rather within Europe, which means that India, for example, has a powerful interest in purchasing some of that oil below the price cap in order to take advantage of those services, which provide more reliability.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm short on time here. There's no question everybody would like to buy oil as cheaply as they possibly can. And I completely acknowledge that this regime, if it's effective with G7 countries, might very well have some downward pressure. But there will also be efforts to evade it. There will be countries that will see an opportunity to get more discounted oil, even if it's not fully discounted to the price level. This is why I think it's important that we address this question. I acknowledge that the big majority of the market for the service providers comes from companies within the G7. They would be affected by this, but they don't have monopolies. And the Chinese and the Indians, as I say, they're quite capable of expanding the role of their indigenous service providers. This isn't meant as really even a criticism of this arrangement. I'm suggesting this is why Senator Van Hollen and I have introduced legislation that would require sanctions to be imposed on those who would evade this way. Let me ask you another question, if I could. What's your best estimate right now of the marginal cost of producing a barrel of oil in Russia?
Senator, there's varying costs for doing so. It depends on the geology of the field, the technology involved in lifting, and the cost over time of amortization. I hope I could take just 1 second to address a key facet of the point you made earlier.
Okay, but I do have another point I need to get to, and we've got a minute, so if we could do it quickly.
A key aspect of a successful price cap policy is the international approach involved here and the entirety of the G7. It is the case that some service providers may be able to function outside of it, but the broad coalition of the G7 and the existence of price cap means that even outside of it, purchasers have the opportunity and leverage in order to ratchet down the price that they pay.
I get that, and I'm hoping that that dynamic works. And if that market dynamic works and Indian and Chinese buyers end up paying no more than the cap price, then our sanctions legislation is kind of moot. It'll sit there as a backstop without doing any harm, without being implemented. But if it doesn't work, and let's be honest, the Russians have taken in a lot of revenue we didn't fully anticipate, then we'd have a backstop. My point on the price level is I think it makes sense, and I'm open to an alternative idea, but I think it makes sense. I don't think you guys have set a price cap level yet. I hope it will be very close to the marginal cost of production, and I get that that varies over the course of a massive country like Russia, but still, keeping it as low as possible diminishes the profits that the Russians make. I think that's a very important step. But last point, Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me, just an observation for Mr. Adams' sake. I know the administration has proposed expanding justices' resources and tools to pursue administrative civil forfeiture and punish sanction evasions. I think enhancements might very well be appropriate to penalize Russia's aggression in Ukraine, but the administration's proposals seem generally not to be limited to Russia, nor to be time limited. And I think we should proceed very, very cautiously before we decide to expand these prosecutorial and administrative powers in areas unrelated to this invasion. Thank you.
Senator Tillis is recognized from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is that because I wore a tie today?
It was why. That's right.
Thank you all for being here. What research has been conducted to, you were talking about maybe a lot of the Russian consumption being at the price cap, possibly negotiated below it, but what are going to be the biggest changes in terms of consumption? What countries, who are the top 3 countries that are likely to greatly increase their dependence on Russian oil over the next 12 months?
Senator, thank you for the question. The European Union has decided in its 6th sanctions package to stop the purchase of Russian oil and refined product, and that will take effect in December 5th for oil. So the several million barrels that Europe has been purchasing will flow elsewhere. Generally, that may include countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America. There's not one single country or 2 that would take on all of it. It will likely be an array of countries.
Would China and India top the list of some of the greatest increased consumption?
Those are significant consuming countries for Russia already. It's possible that it could increase additionally there, but the volume of flow that will come from Russia, given Europe's pullback from the market, will flow to many countries.
So do you think the price cap alone is enough to get the price where we want it to be? Or is there going to be a need for secondary sanctions so that we go beyond the U.S. and the G7?
The price cap, we believe, will have a powerful effect in doing several things. Certainly, in the first instance, denying Russia revenue to fund its war. And secondly, by keeping Russian oil on the market at lower prices, it will reduce the potential for price spikes in the market. It enhances security of supply. It makes affordable energy available for lower-income countries. All of those things are important benefits to a price environment that's good for our economy and our partners' economies.
The Russians have, Putin made a grave mistake when he went into Ukraine. He's seeing that play out on the battlefield. We're talking about tens of thousands of casualties, probably 25,000 deaths. Now we also know that their supply chains have been greatly disrupted. Their ability to replace a lot of what they've lost on the battlefield has been greatly disrupted. And so they're going to countries like North Korea and Iran to look for support, I believe that's already in violation of sanctions. What more do we need to do to curb that and limit Russia's options outside of their own indigenous defense industrial base?
Senator, it is certainly a violation of sanctions when entities in Iran or North Korea supply Russian designated entities with military equipment. So, for example, earlier this month, the Treasury Department imposed sanctions on Iranian entities that were supplying UAVs to Russia in violation of our Russia sanctions. And our approach here will be to continue to impose sanctions to hold accountable those suppliers to Russian designated entities.
Are there any in the works now based on transactions that have already occurred?
Senator, I'm not in the position to forecast or speak about sanctions that may be coming, but please rest assured that this is a significant priority for us.
I think there's estimated, is it $300 billion in Russian assets that have been seized by the United States?
Senator, I can respond at least in part. With respect to seizures, that's correct as it...
Or frozen. Frozen, not seized.
Thank
right?
you, sir. There is a distinction.
Now, the question is, how can we seize them? And what legal hurdles do you have for doing that?
Thank you, Senator. So it is one of the department's priorities to look at the assets that are close to hand and most readily investigatable. Those include assets that are frozen in the United States. We have a focus on looking at whether those relate to the proceeds of crime or have been facilitating money laundering.
What is the worldwide number on frozen assets, and have any of those in other jurisdictions been seized?
Senator, the estimations of the total number range into the billions. I don't have a precise number to offer. There are foreign partners who have certainly frozen assets abroad, and in at least some jurisdictions, there are authorities that may ultimately lead to seizure and full confiscation, much like our civil forfeiture and criminal forfeiture.
Well, I, for one, hope we put on the foot on the accelerator and do everything we can to make sure that that money never falls back into the hands of the oligarchs. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Cho. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of our witnesses. As the chairman and others have said, the Ukrainian people have inspired people throughout our country and throughout the world in their fight for freedom and for sovereignty. And the support from the United States and our allies to the people of Ukraine has been essential in that fight, both the military support and the economic sanctions. And I want to applaud the Biden administration for working with our allies to provide that essential military equipment and to impose those sanctions very rapidly. And we've seen projections of Russian GDP having declined as a result of that. We all recognize, and I know the Biden administration does as well, that the one area where Russia has continued to generate a lot of revenue to fund their war machine is in their sale of energy, gas, and especially oil. And so I also applaud the administration's effort with G7 to establish the price cap. I think we all know, a lot of us have been following this closely. I chair the FISG subcommittee. We had a hearing on June 14th with Deputy Secretary Diemo, where we covered some of these issues. And it's pretty clear that there's some skepticism among oil traders about whether this will work. That's why I'm really pleased to team up with Senator Toomey to introduce legislation which, as he described it, we see as a complement to the administration's effort, a backstop, because you can easily imagine Vladimir Putin saying that he's not going to comply with this price cap, and that will set off a negotiation with those around the world who may be willing to purchase oil for a little bit above the price cap, which is still in their interest compared to global prices. And so the idea behind this legislation is to provide a uniform backstop worldwide and say to any financial institution that's thinking about financing or participating in a transaction to purchase a Russian oil above the price cap set by the G7 will face penalties. And if you're right, and we hope you are, that you don't need anything like that, people comply voluntarily, great. But if they don't, you'd have a backstop. And again, if it works perfectly, you won't need it. So I guess my question is, what is your sense of the need for additional leverage? Wouldn't you support something that gives you a little bit extra leverage as you go around negotiating this price cap? Assistant Secretary Rosenberg.
Thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to address this point. We have the U.S. administration and our G7 partners have a good deal of leverage and authorities right now in order to pursue a policy that sets out, as you have recognized, a powerful set of incentives for purchasers of Russian oil to purchase that oil at cut rate prices at below the cap here. We also have authorities that we can bring to bear for the purposes of enforcement, which I believe you're specifically addressing, when there is an instance, for example, of a purchaser that has committed fraud, that has made material misrepresentations to service providers that are acting in good faith to follow this price cap policy. That's the focus that, to the extent that we need to use enforcement measures, that would be of primary concern for us. And at this time, we have sufficient authorities in order to pursue those avenues.
I guess, Madam Secretary, that as Senator Toomey pointed out, if you're Russia, you're going to be hell-bent on trying to develop different avenues to sell your oil at a price somewhat higher than whatever price the G7 sets. And so this mechanism signals to Russia and others around the world that if you're involved in some kind of scheme to evade these price caps, you will be hit, and it will be automatic. And I believe one of the benefit of putting this sort of threat of sanctions out in advance is everybody's on full alert that this is the law and this will apply. Clearly, if somebody is buying in good faith, there can be exceptions for those purposes. But I do think there's a great benefit to having a worldwide backup so that Russia does not try, as it's bound to do, to play countries against each other if those countries know they're all going to be subject to the same uniform sanction penalty. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, everyone. Senator Menendez of New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start off by commending the administration's leadership on the price cap. A successful cap, however, requires agreement from a broad group of countries and is a delicate balancing act. So, Secretary Rosenberg, where are we at in terms of securing the necessary buy-in and support to make the price cap work? Is there buy-in from other major economies beyond the G7?
Thank you, Senator, for the question and the opportunity to speak to this. In negotiating and crafting the price cap policy, we've worked very closely with partners in the G7, and in this instance, that includes the EU, so all of the EU nations as well. That was enshrined and articulated in the G7 ministerial statement from several weeks ago with a commitment to implement this strategy. So we're in a very strong place when it comes to coordination across this group. That's meaningful because a significant majority of services for the maritime transport of Russian oil are concentrated in these countries. We've also had the opportunity to speak with major purchasing economies that are not part of the G7, but that would be in a position, already have been, and will continue to be purchasers of Russian oil. And they understand the purpose of this policy, and we have significant common cause with them when it comes to their ability to purchase Russian oil at significantly decreased rates.
Let me ask you, how much of a concern is Russia's efforts to create alternative insurance mechanisms? And what are we doing to make those efforts ineffective?
Thank you, Senator. Russia does have insurance, maritime insurance, that it has used. It doesn't have enough insurance in order to support all Russian oil that it exports, which is one of the reasons why insurance provided by European countries has been important, and I think will continue to be important for purchasers of Russian oil. Furthermore, those purchasers of Russian oil know that to use VLCC tankers, some of the largest tankers, they are essentially required to use European insurance. So there's a powerful incentive for those purchasers to continue to access G7 insurance and other services for the purchase of Russian oil.
Well, India's importation of Russian oil has skyrocketed, helping it to maintain Russia's exports. How successful is our ongoing engagement with India on agreeing to adhere to a price cap? And can the price cap actually work if India and China are not part of the coalition of countries implementing it?
Thank you, Senator. It is the case that India has significantly increased its purchase of Russian oil. That is conceived of in this policy when it comes into force, and India continuing to purchase, including at a significant volume, it can be entirely consistent with the price cap. What's key is that India is in the position to negotiate a lower price, a significantly lower price for the oil that it purchases. And to the latter question that you just asked, it's not essential that countries such as India or others in Southeast Asia, for example, that purchase, or East Asia, that purchase Russian oil, it's not essential that they formally join the price cap in order to be able to use that cap to leverage a very low cost of oil. That will advance our purpose, driving down Russia's revenue and also keeping Russian oil on the market at depressed prices for security of supply.
That's a great point, but it's also a question. If China wants to help Russia, then it can purchase oil beyond the price cap, and it is a direct way of helping Russia at a critical time without being more directly involved in Ukraine. So at some point, we have to think about how these are not just any economies. These are major importing economies in terms of India and China, and how they act in this context is going to be critical as to how successful we are. And I look forward to see how we're going to deal with that. I get concerned about, I have been the author of more sanctions than I'd like to remember, and the challenge is, of course, enforcement and dealing with evasion. And so it's critical that the United States crack down on entities and nations that seek to evade and subvert Western sanctions. I'm particularly concerned about possible sanctions evasions by Turkish financial institutions through their use of Russia's domestic payment system, MIR. I was pleased to see that the U.S. just sanctioned the CEO of NSPK, which oversees MIR's operations. What further steps is the administration taking to close loopholes that allow Western sanctions to be undermined through the use of the MIR payment system?
Thank you, Senator. We're quite concerned about the potential for evasion for Russian sanctions broadly in any jurisdiction. And as you note, this is one jurisdiction that we've focused on. Our Deputy Secretary has made a specific effort in that regard. We're also interested in how existing financial connectivity that Russia has to the rest of the world, whether in the payment service you noted or others, whether those can be abused. We should think of any such connectivity as potentially vulnerable and appropriate for enhanced due diligence. We will continue to engage with Turkey to focus on that vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Chairman, I have one final question, if I may. Sure. Thank you. Mr. Adams, we've seen a lot of high-profile yachts seized and whatnot, although I don't know how much it costs us to maintain it before we can get rid of it, so I don't know what the net effect of that is, but certainly to those who lost it, it's significant. The long-term success of a successful seizure effort will come down to coordination and information sharing at multiple levels across jurisdictions. What are some of the biggest obstacles to ensuring a robust effort to identify and seize privately held assets, and how's the U.S. aiding jurisdictions, other jurisdictions, to ensure that that takes place?
Thank you, Senator. I appreciate the concern behind that question. The biggest obstacle historically has been communication across borders and dealing with our international partners. In the wake of the February invasion, those obstacles have diminished greatly. There's been, in my experience, a significant uptick in the ability and the interest of international sharing, both in terms of law enforcement and intelligence. The key hurdle previously was a mismatch and a misalignment between the U.S. sanctions regime on the one hand and foreign partner sanctions regimes on the other. As the European Union, as our partners in the United Kingdom and elsewhere around the globe have come into alignment with our sanctions regime, it has greatly increased our ability to effect seizures, to effect requests for searches, to request arrests, et cetera. That, I think, will only continue as those regimes continue to come into alignment, and in particular as our partners in Europe and the United Kingdom continue to work on legislation of their own that will increase their own ability to proceed on civil asset forfeiture or an analogous proceeding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Rounds from South Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both of you for appearing before us today. Ms. Rosenberg, as you know, the use of sanctions has increased astronomically since the end of the Cold War. My question is do you believe that sanctions are an effective way to advance U.S. national security and policy priorities?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I do believe that sanctions are an effective way to advance U.S. policy objectives, not by themselves, in coordination with other authorities and tools of statecraft, including diplomacy, when appropriate, the use of military or intelligence tools, and furthermore, they are most effective when used alongside international partners, both as an economic matter and as a signaling matter to the target of the sanctions.
In a globalized economy where Russia can still earn $1 billion a day in oil revenue, even while being heavily sanctioned, how do we make certain that our economic and other non-military tools actually stay effective?
Senator, to this excellent point, I would refer back to my comment previously on the multilateralism here. So the United States is, of course, a significantly sized economy, but there are other significantly sized economies that have even greater connectivity with Russia. And when we act together, given their connectivity to Russia, it will have the greatest effect in causing economic and financial isolation for Russia. That's how sanctions, multilateral sanctions, can be most effective.
It seems interesting that and even though they've actually reduced the amount that they've produced and been able to deliver, and the fact that they've got supply chain problems as well, with the price going up, there were two messages that I'd heard earlier in your opening statement. The first is that we're successfully actually limiting and seeing their economy actually reduce in terms of its overall value. And yet at the same time, their largest industry, which is the production of petroleum, has substantially increased. Am I missing something between the two? It seems that the sanctions, specifically with regard to their ability to produce and to market oil, doesn't seem to have worked as well as what we had hoped that it would. Is that a fair statement?
Senator, these sanctions, this broad international coalition of sanctions and export controls, are having the effect of overall constraining Russia's economy and putting it into pretty difficult and dire conditions. Nevertheless, the particular area that you've noted in energy is actually the last significant remaining Russian opportunity to earn hard currency. To many people, including members of this committee, that's intolerable, that Russia should still continue to earn windfall profits from the sale of this energy, which is why we seek to address it with further policy measures.
Thank you. Mr. Adams, it's my understanding that your task force is fully empowered to use the most cutting-edge investigating techniques, including data analytics, cryptocurrency tracing, foreign intelligence sources, and information from financial regulators and private sector partners to identify sanctions, evasion, and related criminal misconduct. In discussions with other federal offices, I've been told that frequently the private sector actually provides more and better information than other sectors of the federal government. I guess my question would be, what role does the private sector play in assisting you in identifying Russia's evasion efforts? And have you experienced a similar level of information sharing?
Thank you, Senator. The private sector has been an enormous partner throughout this effort. And I'm referring here to the banking sector, to the financial services sector generally, to the insurance industry, to shipping industry, et cetera. There are instances in which our job as law enforcement officers cannot be done without witnesses who have firsthand knowledge of how the economy is working on the ground, and have specific knowledge about particular sanctions evaders, as you note. Working with the banking sector is not separate, in my mind, from working with the public sector and law enforcement. It's a symbiosis. We get information through bank secrecy reporting channels. We get information through less formal informants, et cetera. To be able to marry those sources of information with confidential sources, for example, to measure it, to marry it with our ability to proceed via search warrants, et cetera, amplifies both sides of what is essentially the same coin.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time has expired.
Thank you, Senator Rounds. Senator Smith from Minnesota is recognized from her office.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our panelists for this excellent hearing. My question is around global food insecurity. The Russian war in Ukraine is contributing to a global food security crisis. Somalia is one of the worst hit countries. Before the war, Ukraine and Russia contributed up to 90% of Somalia's grain supply, and now an estimated 7 million Somalis are facing acute food insecurity and near famine conditions. And despite some progress in restoring shipments of wheat to East African nations, we continue to see Russian efforts to steal and divert grain supplies and threats from Russian President Putin to look at reducing future shipments. So, Ms. Rosenberg, I was very glad to see last week the Treasury announcing new sanctions against individuals that are overseeing the seizure and the theft of Ukraine's grain. Could you talk to us about how we can do more to use sanctions and other tools of economic statecraft to hold Russia accountable for intentionally exacerbating this food crisis?
Thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to speak to food insecurity and Russia's role in enhancing, unfortunately, the food insecurity that exists for so many countries. One thing that's important we have found to point out is the necessity to clarify the fact that our sanctions do not bear on the export of or the trade of food, medicine, or medical devices. That speaks to misinformation out there. In fact, what we've sought to do is to clarify that we have permission in all of our sanction structure to ensure that such trade can continue. We've issued general licenses to that effect and additional guidance. It is important to hold accountable those entities, including in Russia, that have been responsible for stealing Ukrainian grain and destroying their agricultural equipment, from blockading the export of Ukrainian grain. And as you've noted, it's particularly outrageous and dismaying that Russia has been engaging in these activities given the profound need by countries that are food insecure for this food aid that Ukraine has been in the position of supplying, as well as Russia, in the past. Beyond efforts that we can bring forward and continue to do so to hold accountable those in Russia that are responsible, it's furthermore essential to ensure that that grain is able to be exported. And so the agreements, the negotiated agreements that have come into place and hopefully will be retained in order to allow that grain to continue to be exported on the water will be just as essential as holding accountable those who are responsible for preventing the export of that grain. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to, just in the time that I have left, I'd like to follow up on the excellent questions from Senator Menendez and also Senator Rounds around strategies that Russia is deploying to evade sanctions. It seems as if this is a constantly evolving battle, right, between new strategies on the part of Russia to evade sanctions, and then our efforts to adapt and to evolve as well. So maybe, Mr. Adams, could you just talk a little bit about that? How have Russia's strategies to evade coalition sanctions evolved, and how are our detection and enforcement strategies evolving in response?
Thank you, Senator. In many ways, I think we see the same playbook for sanctions evasion today that we've seen for years. There's clearly a drive to evade export controls, in particular, given the stark deficiencies of the Russian military and the ability to rearm itself. And so, from a strategic standpoint, we at the department are looking at efforts to evade both the financing, sanctionable financing of controlled exports, and looking specifically at new financiers and new shell companies, new financial services firms that are popping up in order to essentially play a shell game in terms of how to hide that money. One strategy that we have adopted with the task force is to be as public as quickly as possible in setting out a roadmap for the private sector to look at. When we unseal affidavits, when we take actions, we try to speak with as much detail as possible about the specific companies involved, the specific route of money that's going through the financial system, so that we have an outsized effect beyond a particular case or a particular seizure, so that banks, insurance companies, financial services firms can look at our work product and take their own action as they instill their own cultures of compliance.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Smith. Senator Daines from Montana is recognized.
Chairman, thank you. I was one of the first U.S. officials to visit Ukraine following Putin's invasion on February 24th. That was mid-April. I went over. Following that visit, I saw Putin's atrocities firsthand. In fact, I brought a New York Times reporter with me as we went and saw the atrocities there in the Bucha area, of course, kind of north and a bit to the west of Kyiv. I pushed the Biden administration on my return to take immediate actions to reopen the U.S. Embassy, as well as to send more lethal aid to the Ukrainian people. On Sunday, The Guardian reported that Ukraine is lobbying the UN General Assembly to adopt a resolution to establish a mechanism that could lead to the seizure of as much as $300 billion of Russian state assets overseas. As the war raged on and Russia's actions became more brutal and barbaric, I then urged Treasury Secretary Yellen to impose tighter sanctions on Russia's financial institutions. In June, the U.S. Department of Justice stated the U.S. and its allies have frozen $30 billion. I believe the number now is closer to $39 billion of Russian elite assets and $300 billion of Russian central bank assets held overseas. Not long ago, we introduced a bill, Senate Bill 4283, that would authorize the Biden administration to confiscate these Russian assets and use these assets to offset the cost of our nation's assistance to Ukraine. I can tell you, when you talk that with the taxpayers of this country, they think that is a great idea, as we have been most generous in sending aid over to Ukraine. I think it seems prudent that we take advantage of our sanctions to the fullest and repurpose these Russian funds to help pay for the response to their invasion of Ukraine. For Mr. Adams and for Ms. Rosenberg, can either of you offer guidance on what the Biden administration plans to do with the roughly $39 billion of seized Russian assets? And by the way, it's kind of a nice balance. We authorized about $40 billion in change to support the Ukrainians. We've got about $39 billion in seized Russian assets. What's the administration do with that, and why can't we just take those dollars here and use as an offset for the aid we have sent to Ukraine? We'll start with Mr. Adams.
Thank you, Senator. The concern behind the question is entirely felt within the department and the administration, heartfelt by the people at the task force. And the task force, the department, stands ready to work with you, your office, with the committee, with the Senate to talk about legislation that has been proposed, that may be proposed, that may further expand our ability to go
So just,
after.
and then thank you for that. And heartfelt, that's great. Concern, it's wonderful, but why aren't we taking action? What is the barrier prohibiting us from taking these seized assets here and using those to offset the aid that we send to Ukraine? The taxpayer would love to see that, I can tell you that.
Thank you, Senator. So to go directly to the hurdles here, with respect to frozen assets, which I think is a key distinction here between what has been seized pursuant to our warrants and
What's the frozen asset number that you, if you were looking at your tally, what's that number?
I think that's the number that you're referring to.
Yeah, correct. Okay, just make sure we're on the same page, because that does match virtually what we sent to Ukraine. It's around about $40 billion.
And there are, with respect to frozen assets that sit in bank accounts, that sit in securities holdings, those are not entirely coextensive with what is today forfeitable. What we can bring a seizure warrant to go and ultimately divest all ownership.
How much do you think we could provide a seizure warrant and actually take?
It's difficult to predict today, and it's under investigation right now. The question is, as a general matter, are the assets either traceable to the proceeds of an existing crime, involved in money laundering, or the assets of a racketeering enterprise?
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg, your thoughts?
Thank you, Senator. Let me just affirm that it's certainly our common cause and interest to pursue the restitution for the Ukrainian people. I would associate myself with the sentiment that it's challenging to move from frozen assets to forfeited assets, and there's a distinction between assets that are state assets versus assets that apply to oligarchs or to individuals, creating different legal standards for the both of them. Additionally, some of those assets that you've noted are held in the United States and U.S. jurisdiction, and others are held abroad. It's most important that we move in parallel to certain of our international counterparts in order to have consistency and credibility across our regimes.
Would legislation help?
Senator, from the department's perspective, there are proposals that the department is engaged with the Senate on that would help, I think, expand our ability both to investigate and ultimately to pursue the forfeiture of assets that are under consideration.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks, Senator Daines. Senator Sinema from Arizona is recognized from her office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Arizonans and Americans continue to stand with the Ukrainian people against Russia's illegal war. We're inspired by the courage and the determination of the Ukrainian people. We must continue to take smart, aggressive action to disrupt and dismantle Vladimir Putin's war machine and bring this bloody, illegal conflict to a close. Earlier this month, the Russian government announced that Putin has personally sanctioned me, Senator Kelly, and other distinguished members of this committee. You know, when Senator McCain served in the Senate, he was sanctioned by Putin in the exact same way. And I couldn't be prouder to share such a distinction with him. I consider it a badge of honor. What he said in response to Russia was this, quote, "While I suppose this means I'll spend this Easter in Sedona rather than Siberia, I couldn't be more proud of being sanctioned by Vladimir Putin for standing up for freedom and human rights for the Russian people and against Putin's deadly aggression in Ukraine. I'll never stop my efforts to support democracy, free speech, and the rule of law in Russia," end quote. I couldn't agree more. Assistant Secretary Rosenberg, it's good to see you. I'm encouraged by reports that the Russian military is being forced to repurpose domestic industry to obtain key inputs for its battlefield hardware because no respected world power will sell to them. This success shows what's possible when nations put aside differences and work together towards a common goal. Can you expand on the direct combat implications of this achievement? And are these international export restrictions a factor in why the Russian military had to pull back from Kharkiv a few weeks ago?
Thank you, Senator, for the opportunity to discuss this issue. Indeed, we do believe that export restrictions and financial sanctions are directly meaningful for Russia's difficulty in sourcing modern, state-of-the-art battlefield equipment. The soldiers on its front line don't have access to key warfighting equipment, which degrades its readiness, its posture, and its ability to wage this war. Specifically, we've noticed and pointed out Russia's difficulty in getting access to chips, certain high-tech equipment that is significant as components to certain battlefield equipment. As you've rightly noted, Russia is not in the position, has struggled to be able to procure this on the open market because responsible countries of the world have denied it the opportunity to procure those goods. That's something that we'll seek to continue. Those export controls continue to tighten. They are a vice that continues to tighten, and successively over time it will be more and more difficult for Russia to source that equipment, meaning that its second-rate material is an impediment for battlefield readiness for the period of the war yet ahead of us, unfortunately.
Thank you. Do you have a sense of which industrial goods and technology are the most devastating for global suppliers to withhold from the Russian military?
Senator, I didn't catch the beginning of your question, but to the extent that this is about particular goods and technology controlled by...
Yes.
Yes. I would defer to my Commerce Department colleagues who maintain the lists and the particular prohibitions, as well as my Defense Department colleagues and their analysts to make an assessment of what is most significant to Russia's warfighting ability and its battlefield readiness. But as I believe you've noted, the broad array of restrictions across many categories of equipment and technology that Russia uses to source its battlefield equipment are important, as well as the complementary financial sanctions that also seek to deprive Russia the opportunity to make such procurements.
Thank you. I also want to ask you about the efficacy of current restrictions on Russian oil exports. Some reports state that Russian oil producers are attempting to circumvent the spirit of these restrictions by blending their oil with oil from other countries so that the percentage of Russian oil falls beneath 50%. Under current rules, that would allow the oil to be branded as a non-Russian country's blend, even though nearly half of the oil revenue will continue to go to Russia. Is this an issue of concern for the United States, or is this primarily an issue for the European Commission?
Thank you. At this time, we are putting together, as you know, and we've had the opportunity to discuss here, the price cap policy, which will come into force on December 5th. The point that you've made about blending of Russian crude is one that we've heard from other individuals and people in the industry. We have an opportunity to offer further clarity and guidance on this important point in the forthcoming guidance and frequently asked questions that the U.S. government will put out in the coming weeks to effectuate our price cap, and our partners in other G7 countries will have the opportunity to do so as well to clarify the specificity here. But it is important to remember that Russian oil on the water is Russian oil on the water under the purposes of the price cap policy. Thank you.
And my final question, does the department support European Commission efforts to tighten restrictions on this very type of blending scheme?
Thank you, Senator. We work very closely with the European Commission, which is part of the G7, which is part of the coalition for the price cap, so G7 countries and the EC. We all collectively see the price cap policy as strengthening and enforcing the existing set of restrictions that we have to respond to Russia. And what it does is build upon the EU's sixth package. It passed in the spring that has the provisional legal basis for its ban on Russian services for third countries. So we will certainly work closely with the EU and other G7 partners as we continue to implement this policy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada is recognized from her office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to both Ms. Rosenberg and Mr. Adams. Mr. Adams, let me talk with you. Let me just say this. I appreciate President Biden's implementing a robust sanctions against the Russian government to stop the illegal and unprovoked invasion against the people of Ukraine. I also appreciate the work that you're doing in creation of the Klepto Capture Task Force. Let me just talk to you about two things, because I have two proposals that I'm working on, and thank you. I know we've reached out to DOJ and the administration about this. But here's what I'm interested in your position on. Can you talk about the benefits of adding the crime of sanctions evasion to the definition of racketeering activity under Rico? As you well know, there's civil and criminal actions under the Racketeer, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. And I'm interested in your thoughts if adding the crime of sanctions evasion would be helpful in the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Senator, and my thanks to both you and your staff for the conversations about the proposed legislation. We're committed to continue those conversations. It would be helpful in a number of respects to add IEPA and ECRA violations to the list of RICO predicates. There are a number of ways in which that we expect that would inure to the benefit of seizing assets. Under the RICO criminal provisions and the forfeiture laws, the ability to go after racketeering enterprises and the assets, all assets of a racketeering enterprise, is a particularly powerful forfeiture tool, and it's one that's appropriate in the context of sophisticated, complicated, complex, multinational racketeering enterprises that are engaged in a number of financial crimes. It's the case that, as we've talked about today on a number of points, that what we see are efforts to evade sanctions in Russia, but they also tie into efforts to evade sanctions in Iran and North Korea. There are partnerships and growing partnerships in Iran and North Korea, in particular due to the success of our sanctions regime and the success of the export control regime. The ability to look at financial service providers, for example, to look at facilitators who are engaged generally in the efforts to make a buck on the back of sanctions evasion, irrespective of where in the world those sanctions evasions are taking place, would be particularly powerful and allow us to go after a broader set of actors and to use a particularly powerful forfeiture hammer to ultimately inure to the benefit of Ukraine.
Thank you. And listen, I so appreciate your answers to some of the questions today. I have taken action both under civil and criminal RICO and addressed and tried to take action under forfeiture laws as well. It is very challenging. There's no doubt about it. And there's certain property rights that have to be taken into consideration. I do think we need to make sure that we are giving you all the tools that you need under our existing laws. And by adding just a sanctions evasion as a RICO predicate would be one of the easiest things that we can do to give you more opportunity to take the action that we're all asking you to take, quite honestly. The second thing I want to ask you is, I know the administration seeks to extend the statute of limitations for acts against the U.S. for sanctions evasions from 5 to 10 years. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that's important?
Thank you, Senator. And the proposal here is, as you say, to extend the statute of limitations, focusing on, in particular, activity and unlawful activity that's taking place abroad. The reason for the request is the difficulty in conducting those kinds of investigations in particular. I mentioned earlier that the realignment and the continuing alignment of our sanctions regime and our foreign partner sanctions regime is encouraging. It's been robust, particularly in the last few months. That said, the difficulties of conducting transnational investigations of piercing often opaque jurisdictions that have an interest in concealing or providing a harbor for those who would conceal illegal activity is a tall order. It requires intensive resources, and it at times requires multiple years of investigation.
Right. So in essence, you just need more time for the investigation. You don't have that because of the extent of the assets and what you're dealing with in an international perspective. So thank you again. I so appreciate both of you and the work that you do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Cortez. Senator Warren from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, ever since President Biden announced sanctions against Russia for the invasion of Ukraine in February, I've had serious concerns about Russian elites potentially using cryptocurrency to evade sanctions. Back then, we already knew that countries like North Korea had used crypto to skirt sanctions and launder at least hundreds of millions of dollars. And Russia could easily be part of that. So that's why I introduced the Digital Asset Sanctions Compliance Enhancement Act with many of my colleagues actually on this committee to strengthen our sanctions regime. Since my bill's introduction in March, Treasury has identified numerous cases of Russian entities attempting to evade sanctions with crypto. In April, Treasury sanctioned multiple Russian crypto mining companies. Just last week, Treasury sanctioned 5 crypto addresses tied to a Russian neo-Nazi paramilitary group. And on top of that, Russia's deputy finance minister announced earlier this month that Russia is looking into using stablecoins as a way around Western sanctions. Assistant Secretary Rosenberg, could digital assets be used right now by Russian oligarchs to evade sanctions on Russia?
Yes, Senator, that's possible.
All right. I appreciate your candid answer here. Many crypto boosters continue to claim that crypto could never be used as a way to evade sanctions. Despite the evidence to the contrary, they say that because blockchain is transparent, anybody can see where the tokens are moving, so no problem here. Now, obviously, we know there are problems. A whole industry has popped up to create tools for illicit actors to tangle or hide the trail of crypto transactions. One of these tools is called a mixer, which pools funds with the explicit purpose of hiding the origins of the funds. In fact, one report estimates that so far this year, nearly a quarter of all funds sent to mixers came from illicit actors. Assistant Secretary Rosenberg, let's start with the basics. Do mixers and other technology used to hide crypto transactions make it harder for Treasury officials to do their job of enforcing sanctions?
Anonymity-enhancing technologies such as mixers that you mentioned are indeed a concern for understanding the flow of illicit finance and getting after it. It is true that what you note, that on a public blockchain, it is possible to trace the source of money and where it's flowing. The detractor from that would be anonymity-enhancing technologies.
That's right, like these mixers. Yeah. So that's why I was glad to see last month that Treasury sanctioned Tornado Cash, a mixer used by a North Korea-linked hacking group to launder nearly $500 million. Earlier this year, the mixing service Blender was sanctioned for laundering funds for Russian and North Korean groups. Now, some in the crypto industry are furious over these sanctions, and they're fighting to have the chance to keep right on laundering money. Some downplay, some even lie about the risks associated with their products. One of the industry witnesses who testified before this committee earlier this year claimed that mixers don't make it easier for illicit actors to hide their transactions. Well, that was clearly wrong. Tornado Cash alone has been used to launder over $7 billion, with nearly 30% of its current business tied to illicit actors. Even so, Coinbase, the largest U.S.-based crypto exchange, is now bankrolling a lawsuit against Treasury for its work to sanction these mixers. So, Assistant Secretary Rosenberg, will sanctions against mixers like Tornado Cash help strengthen our sanctions regime against Russia and other illicit actors?
Thank you, Senator. Sanctions, such as the one that you've noted, when they can serve as a deterrent to any criminal that would seek to use a mixer in order to launder their funds, the funds of the proceeds of corruption or other criminal activity, that's an effective avenue we can use in order to signal that we cannot tolerate money laundering. So whether that's for a Russian criminal actor, an Iranian, a North Korean, or wherever they may come from.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, one thing I've learned over the past couple of years is when the crypto boosters cry the loudest, you're probably onto something. If crypto has nothing to hide on money laundering for oligarchs or drug lords or tax evaders, then they shouldn't mind a little transparency. Thanks very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warren. Senator Ossoff from Georgia is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to both of our panelists for your service and your testimony today. Assistant Secretary Rosenberg, I'd like to begin with you. What will be the most significant implementation challenges associated with the G7 price cap?
Thank you for the question. We've already worked significantly to begin essentially implementing this with discussing it publicly, explaining it publicly. It's a different kind of sanction or a different kind of financial set of rules than we've imposed before, along with our G7 partners. So there's a good deal of work to be done, a good challenge to be had in explaining this and clarifying it to the parties that would be in the position to take to use it. And that includes the service providers that must know and understand it in order to be able to work within its parameters. We have sought to engage those service providers extensively as we've constructed the framework for compliance, and have learned a great deal from them, as well as from other countries that purchase Russian oil and that would seek to purchase Russian oil. So a challenge we have is being able to continue to discuss and explain this broadly with all those in a position to implement it.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. And my understanding is that the guidance that's been issued, according to that guidance, financial institutions that inadvertently capitalize the shipment of oil that is not compliant with the cap will not be penalized for that. How will inadvertent be defined? What due diligence will financial institutions be required to undertake in order to ensure that they're not facilitating oil trades which are not compliant with this arrangement?
Thank you, Senator. Our purpose is indeed strong compliance with the price cap policy, such that purchasers of Russian oil will be in a position to leverage it, as I've noted before. Your reference to the guidance, the preliminary guidance that we put out, does speak to service providers that may be duped or having received false information. If they are acting in good faith, if they are undertaking due diligence in the normal course along the lines of what they are required to do under other compliance frameworks or supervisory frameworks, that is in general terms, the nature of the requirements that we'd expect them to be undertaking here. Our focus, by contrast, as an enforcement matter, would be on those purchasers making these material misrepresentations or lying to those service providers.
Thank you, Ms. Rosenberg. More broadly now, what forms of access to international markets or capital or technology that may not currently be constrained by the sanctions regime as constructed are most essential to the Russian Federation's capacity to generate military power over the next several years? Let me just restate the question for clarity. What forms of access to international markets and capital that the Russian Federation may still enjoy, and to specific technologies, will the Russian government and Russian industry be best able to exploit to generate military power, given the high rate of attrition that they've experienced thus far during operations in Ukraine?
Thank you, Senator, for the question. One key area of focus for us is looking to Russia's significant source of wealth when it comes to its energy sales, its major source of hard currency. at this time. That is important to Russia for budgetary support now and will be in the future, which is why policies such as the price cap policy are essential in degrading its fiscal basis for now and into the future. And I would point out a policy which isn't a U.S. policy, but which will nevertheless be significant, and that is Europe's long-term goal to move away from the purchase of Russian energy and indeed to seek alternative energy supplies and greater efficiency. That has caused Russia to anticipate decline in revenue, very meaningful decline in revenue over the years to come. That's significant when it comes to its ability to sustain any kind of economic growth or achieve any kind of economic growth or sustain it into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. That concludes the questioning, and bringing this hearing to a close. It's important that we all, again, realize what's at stake. The struggle of the Ukrainian people and Putin's inhumane war is the fight between democracy and tyranny. The price is high but clear. Zelensky said it best, describing to Putin what Ukrainians would go without. He said, without gas or without you, without you, without light or without you, without you, without food or without you, without you, without water or without you, without you. That's the strength of Ukrainian resolve, and ours on this committee and in this Congress, and the administration must match it. Congress must work hand in hand with you, with the administration, in our multilateral coalition to protect the sovereignty and to protect the people of Ukraine. Again, thanks to the two of you for being here today and providing testimony. Senators who wish to submit questions, they're due 1 week from today on Tuesday, September 27th. To the two of you as witnesses, please submit your responses to those questions for the record, no more than 45 days from the day you received them. Thank you again. With that, the hearing is adjourned.